Okay, so picture this. It's the late 1400s. A handful of ships from Spain and Portugal set sail, heading west across the vast Atlantic. Now, they weren't just out there discovering new lands. No, they were setting off a chain reaction that would completely reshape two entire continents forever. We're going to dive into the story of that conquest. Its incredible ambition, the methods they used, and its absolutely massive consequences.
I mean, that's a huge question, right? How did just two kingdoms manage to do that and in only a few decades? The sheer speed and scale of it all is just staggering. So let's break it down. We're going to look at the methods they used, the impact it had, and the legacy of this Iberian conquest that's still with us today.
All right, so first things first, why? I mean, what could possibly motivate entire kingdoms to pour resources into sailing across a massive, totally unknown ocean? Well, it turns out it wasn't just one single thing. It was this really powerful mix of ambition, religious faith, and of course, economics.
You can pretty much boil it down to that classic trio: God, gold, and glory. The pull of gold was just immense. We're talking about the dream of finding mountains of gold and silver and growing incredibly valuable crops like sugar. Then there's God, a really passionate, fervent mission to spread Christianity across the globe. And finally, glory. On the world stage, this was a high-stakes political and strategic race. A bigger empire meant more power, more respect, and total control over the most valuable trade routes on the entire planet.
Okay, so they've arrived. They're driven by these massive goals. But now comes the really hard part. How in the world do you manage these huge new territories when you're an entire ocean away? This wasn't something you could just figure out as you go. It required a whole new blueprint for how to run an empire.
Seriously, just think about that for a second. How is that even possible? We're talking no email, no phones, nothing. Just ships that took months to get from one side of the Atlantic to the other. And yet Spain somehow built this incredibly effective system. And you got to remember, it was all designed for one single purpose: to make the Spanish crown rich.
So what was their solution? Well, it was a super rigid top-down hierarchy. At the very top, you had the king, who appointed viceroys to be his personal representatives in the Americas. Think of them like a CEO of a colony. Under them, you had these royal courts called audiencias, and they handled all the legal stuff. But the real brain of the operation, the nerve center, was all the way back in Spain. It was a group called the Council of the Indies, and they made every major decision. The whole point of this setup was total control, just micromanaging everything from trade to taxes to make sure all that wealth flowed straight back to Spain.
And this system of control, it went way beyond just politics. It was baked right into the social fabric. It was this incredibly rigid caste system, all based on your ancestry and where you were born. So at the very top of the pyramid, holding all the real power, were the Peninsulares. These were people born in Spain. Right below them, you had the Creoles. Now, they had Spanish blood, but they were born in the Americas. And because of that, they were often treated like second-class elites. As you go further down, you get the mestizos, who had mixed Spanish and native heritage, and then you have the vast majority of the population, the native peoples. And at the absolute bottom, with no freedom at all, were enslaved Africans. This whole pyramid, it wasn't an accident. It was a very deliberate tool of control designed to keep everyone in their box and stop them from ever teaming up.
But all this wealth, this entire system of control, it came at an absolutely unimaginable human cost. The ambitions of the Spanish Empire were literally built on the backs of the people who were already living in the Americas.
And at the very heart of all this exploitation was a system called the encomienda. Now, on paper, the idea was that the Spanish crown gave settlers the right to demand labor and tribute from native peoples. But that simple, almost bureaucratic definition, it hides a truly brutal reality.
See, the official promise of the system, it actually sounded pretty noble. The Spanish settlers, called encomenderos, were supposed to protect the native peoples under their charge and convert them to Christianity. That was the deal. But the reality? The reality was a system of forced labor so brutal, it was basically slavery in all but name. We're talking about millions of people being literally worked to death in silver mines and on sugar plantations, suffering from exhaustion, unbelievable violence, and starvation.
And the result of this brutal system, combined with disease and constant warfare, was nothing short of a demographic catastrophe. Honestly, even a word like catastrophe just doesn't feel strong enough to capture the sheer scale of what happened.
Within just a few generations of the Europeans showing up, the indigenous population of the Americas just collapsed. The numbers are truly staggering. Some estimates suggest that as much as 90% of the population was lost. It's a scale of death that is almost impossible to wrap your head around. Entire cultures, languages, entire ways of life, they were just wiped off the face of the earth.
So what caused a collapse on this scale? Well, it was like a perfect storm of devastation. The #1 killer by a huge margin was disease. Things like smallpox, measles, the flu, germs that Europeans had built up some immunity to over centuries were completely new and absolutely deadly in the Americas. But that was just part of it. This was made so much worse by the brutal forced labor of the encomienda system, by constant warfare, and by the total disruption of society, which meant people couldn't grow food, leading to widespread famine.
Now, it's easy to think that everyone in the Spanish Empire was just okay with all of this happening, but that's not the whole story. Even in the midst of all this brutality, there were some powerful voices of protest, a kind of crisis of conscience that went all the way to the top.
And that mission really belonged to one of the most remarkable figures of the entire era, a man who saw all of this horror firsthand and decided that he just could not stay silent any longer. His name was Bartolomé de las Casas, and what's so interesting is that he was a Spanish friar who had actually taken part in the conquest himself. But he was so completely horrified by the cruelty he witnessed that he had a total change of heart and dedicated the rest of his life to defending native peoples. He wrote these blistering reports, sailed back to Spain, and went straight to the king to lobby him directly. He really became one of history's first and loudest advocates for human rights. And the wild part is, his activism actually worked. Sort of. In 1542, the king passed something called the New Laws, which were designed to stop the worst abuses of the encomienda. But here's the huge problem. The colonists over in the Americas, whose entire fortunes were built on this system, fought back hard. In trying to enforce laws from thousands of miles away, it was next to impossible. And this led to a really tragic, unintended consequence. As the crown tried to ease the burden on native peoples, the colonists just pivoted. They started importing enslaved people from Africa in even greater numbers. So, in an attempt to fix one horrific injustice, they ended up accelerating another.
So, let's kind of zoom out here for the big picture. In the span of just a couple of hundred years, the world was fundamentally and permanently transformed. And the consequences of everything that happened back then, well, they're not just history. They are absolutely still with us today.
I mean, the legacy is just so profound and so complex. You have entirely new societies created from this violent mixing of European, native, and African cultures. The Americas were dragged, really, into a new global economy. European languages, religions, and systems of government were stamped across 2 whole continents. But for the societies that were there first, the change was absolute. And tragically, it was irreversible.
And all of that leaves us with one final, really important question to think about. When you look around today, at the languages people speak, the social issues we face, even the very borders on our maps, how do the echoes of this 500-year-old conquest continue to shape the Americas, and really the whole world? It's a powerful reminder that this history, well, it isn't really in the past at all. It's all around us.